Last week I made a video about world building and it underperformed considerably. So this week I'm continuing to dig my own grave by telling you about the different kinds of world building, plus one kind of world building that pretty much no one uses. I think we can classify all kinds of world building by the relationship to the real world. First, we have stories that really happened, like biographies or documentary books, like The Emperor of All Maladies, which tells the story of cancer research. You could think that there is no world building here, because the world is already built. But even if you're not making anything up, you still need to replicate a small portion of the real world into your story in order to give it context. And this is world building as well. World building whose objective is to help us understand a small portion of the real world. I call this biographical world building. Next, we have stories that did not happen in the real world, but definitely could have. These are your Pride and Prejudice, your Catcher in the Rye. The world building in these stories is trying to make us believe we are seeing a portion of the real world, even though we might not. For example, The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco happens in an entirely fictional monastery. It doesn't exist. But Umberto Eco describes with a lot of detail the architecture of the monastery, and he describes with a lot of detail again the day-to-day life of the monks, who does what and when, what do they pray, what do they eat, everything. And everything about life in this monastery doesn't feel imagined, but observed. And as a result, it feels like a real place. I call this realistic world building. Next, we have stories that could possibly happen, maybe. We often think about it as science fiction, as stories that could happen in the future, maybe, as technology improves and develops. But it also applies for stories that could have happened in the past, maybe. Stories about Atlantis or about aliens seeding life on Earth, that kind of stuff. The world building in these stories tries to make us believe that what we are seeing could happen, that it could be possible. As such, it often relies on speculating about the possibilities of science. For example, Frankenstein was speculating on the possibilities of medical science back then. But that it's not a necessity. For example, 1984, the book, was published in 1949, the year. And when it did, it wasn't speculating a lot about technology. I mean, the technology in the book is pretty much the same technology that existed back then, except for one speech-to-text machine that doesn't even factor too much into the story. No, the real speculation in 1984 is about the evolution of the political ideologies. That's what really drives the world building in that book. I could call this science fiction world building, but since we've just seen that the science part is not essential, I prefer to call it speculative world building. Finally, we have stories that could never possibly happen, because they have one or more impossible elements. This can be something as simple as a vision of the future, or a message from a ghost, or maybe something more involved, like a Freaky Friday situation, or even full-on magic systems, where there is an extra set of rules that determines how the world works. These are stories like Hamlet, Groundhog Day, or even Harry Potter or The Lord of the Rings. Unsurprisingly, I call this magical world building. Of course, no story fits neatly into any kind. For example, in The Name of the Rose, Umberto Eco wanted to know if there was a real-life poison that worked like the poison in his story, and so he wrote a friend. But when his friend wrote back telling him that there was no such a poison, Umberto Eco just ripped that letter apart and wrote his story anyway. Now, is the inclusion of that poison magic? It's an impossible poison after all. But maybe such a poison could be invented, in which case it would be speculative world building. Star Wars, for example, also has a lot of magical world building, like the Force, but it also has some elements of speculative world building, like lightsabers, if you consider them to be plasma and not literally light. Dune has a lot of very strong speculative world building, But then it also has some magical world building like visions of the future or telepathy. But it's fine, all stories exist in a spectrum between these four different kinds of world building, and you don't have to stick to any kind, they are just helpful guides. But there is another. There is a kind of world building that very few people use in stories, and yet that millions of people use every day and have done so for hundreds of years. We defined all kinds of world building based on what is possible in the real world. But what if we thought about the worlds that are possible? This would really benefit from an example, so let's make one. This is the formula for the gravitational force, and this is the formula for the electric force. Notice how similar they are. The main difference is that electric charge can be either positive or negative, which means that the electric force can be either attractive or repulsive. But the gravitational force can only ever be attractive because negative mass doesn't exist. Or does it? In 1898, Arthur Schuster sent a letter to Nature magazine. And this letter is the first known instance of someone exploring the idea of matter with negative mass. In this letter, he begins explaining what would be its physical properties, and then he imagines that there might be entire planets made of this stuff. He goes on to imagine how it would interact with regular matter and what its existence means for the origin of the universe. And I don't know about you, but this feels a lot like world building, doesn't it? But this is not world building, you might say. This is science! And I hear you. In science, we often have to look at the evidence and make hypotheses about how the universe works. And often these hypotheses turn out to be wrong, in which case we make new ones and move on. But all of these hypotheses that turn out to be wrong are like windows into universes where those hypotheses are right. Worlds that are consistent and logical. Worlds that could be real, but are not. I call this scientific world building. And I know it sounds a lot like speculative world building, but it is not. Because the whole point of speculative world building is to speculate what is possible in our world. But with scientific world building, we are not thinking about our world. These worlds have different rules. In which case we may think that this is a kind of magical world building, but that doesn't work either because these worlds might not be real, but they are possible in a way that magic is not. This is the mantra of scientific world building. Every failed scientific theory is a case of successful world building. This means that the history of science, which is full of failed theories, is actually a treasure trove of ideas for novelists and world builders. You know what? Let's do another example. In 1887, people were trying to find out why the speed of light seemed to be constant while the speed of everything else seemed to be relative. And so they theorized that maybe there was a substance called ether that filled the whole universe, and light was always moving at the same speed relative to this substance. Then two friends, Albert Michelson and Edward Morley, devised a super clever experiment that involved the rotation of the Earth around the Sun to prove once and for all that ether was real. But guess what? Instead, they proved that ether was not real, paving the way for Albert Einstein to come and fix this whole thing. Obviously, I'm overly simplifying here. There are many other excellent YouTube videos that explain this whole thing. I'm gonna link to them, you know where. My point is that when Michaelson and Moorley disproved the existence of ether, they instead transformed it into world building. Why not set your story in a universe where ether is real? And maybe there are regions with ether winds that allow light to move much faster or maybe much slower than in other places. And these regions of space are key for the infrastructure of a new and flourishing galactic merchant republic. Or why not use the negative mass world building? Maybe there are two alien species and one has regular mass and the other one has negative mass. So they can never touch because there is this force stopping them, kind of like when you try to put together two magnets. But they can send radio waves between each other because light has no mass. And so they can communicate, and in this way an alien and a human meet and fall in love, but they can never get close to each other. Or, I don't know, you guys have probably much better ideas than I do. And if so, why don't you share them with us in the comments? I would love to read them. Although, admittedly, the farthest you go back in time in the history of science, the more scientific world building starts looking like magical world building. In the 1600s, the study of gravity and magnetism made people think that maybe there were many other spooky actions at a distance. And some people began seriously thinking that if you were wounded with a knife, you could put medicine on the knife and that would cure your wounds. Which is obviously wrong, we know that now, but it's a very interesting idea. I imagine that maybe there was a girl that was born just as this knife bonding phenomenon is discovered, and she grows up to be a researcher, and she begins researching how to bond to things. I mean, we know that cutting with knife is one way to bond, but are there other ways to create this bonding? And maybe she starts studying the time it takes. Like, okay, we know if you put medicine on the knife, it heals your wound, but how long does it take? If I put acid on the knife, how long until you start feeling that acid on your skin? That sort of things. And maybe she starts looking for new kinds of bonding or how to break those bonds. And in my mind, she ends up being like a necromancer. And she controls a bunch of dead bodies with a bunch of bonded blades she keeps on her cape. And I don't know, I think this idea is really cool. But again, if you have some other cooler ideas, I would love to read them. Please share them with us in the comments. You can go even farther back in the history of science until we reach the Greeks and the theory of the four elements. So, what if that was true? What if everything in the universe really was made of some specific combination of fire, earth, water, and air? Then I imagine this scientist living in a Greek-style civilization that starts discovering recipes, combinations of these four elements to produce anything: gold, flesh, wood, diamond, iron, literally everything. And suddenly, nothing is scarce because everything can be made out of everything else. And this Greek-style civilization becomes this post-scarcity sci-fi civilization in a very short time. I think that's a really cool setting. But again, maybe you have some better ideas of what to do with this. And if you do, please share them with us in the comments. I'm dying to read all of your ideas. As you can see, scientific world building can be really cool. But sadly, it has been very underused in literature. Matter of fact, I can think of very few writers that have used it, but I can think of one that used it for a masterful effect. Isaac Asimov in The Gods Themselves. And join me next week when we are going to be exploring the world building in this book and why it is so amazing. Thanks a lot for watching. If the video from next week sounds interesting to you, please subscribe and give a like. And here are some videos to share. One is my most recent upload, and the other one is the one that the algorithm, the almighty algorithm, thinks that you are gonna enjoy the most. So I hope he's right. And thanks for watching.